The Cato Crest flood victims are calling on the eThekwini Municipality to make good on its province and rebuild their homes. Officials visited the area to assess the damage last week. This was days after 7 people lost their lives due to heavy rain and subsequent flooding. Let's take a listen to this report before we get into a much deeper conversation.
On Saturday, Cato Crest residents pleaded for municipal officials to assess the flood damage at this informal settlement to help them rebuild.
Besicela emkhandlwini nakwimeya yethu ukhawundi asukumele le ward siyacela bandle kuba ukhawundi la khona anake le ward.
On Sunday morning, city officials arrived. While Mayor Xolisi Kaunda was notably absent, executive committee members addressed the community.
The families need to have food. We are coming with the organization that will assist them to give for the breakfast and the lunch. Then the municipality will also do the dinner by activating the soup kitchen that we have as municipality. We are going to help them to get the place where they can put their life back. But we cannot, as municipality, just jump and give them the material as usually we did, because the floods that happens here, it tells us that it can happen again. We need to get the land where we can move them.
The plan to move residents to a space more conducive to living is long awaited.
Besingayitshela ukuthi ngagcina sekwenzeka kanje. So manje siyabona ukuthi seyingozi kakhulu le ndawo. Kungasijabulisa ukuthi basuse phezu kwaleli bridge leli ngoba mina nje isikakhulukazi ngisakuthanda ukuhlala kule ndawo. Ngiyafisa ngaphezulu angisenabazali uma ushiyile ngihleli nezingane, so kunakho ukuthi ngisabe.
But already scorned by their poor living conditions, this community will watch the city closely.
So nje besingacela ukuthi ke ithembisa abasithembise zona kungashintshi kukhona konke lokho abashiye nakho ngoba nathi sibambelele. And last ANC lo ANC sawuthanda ikakhulukazi nje mina wengiphathe kabi omunye umuntu eseceleni mayizoxoxa lo ANC esuthanda kangaka. Ngingakujabulela ukuthi uNC ngoba usufikile la wafika umkhandlu wabeka ebantwini ehlala nabo ithembiso zonke abathembise zona zihambe ngendlela. Ungafika uthembisa abantu egcineni abantu bese bayakhala bese nesafesi sasoqanjelwa amanga ini ngoba kuyimanje abantu abaningi abaphumanga nje ngokuthi bathi sikhathela amanga ka-ANC bafike besitshena amanga bese beshiya nje bengasitshenanga. Kodwa ngiyabonga kakhulu ukuthi sithema sihlaba umkhosi basukumela phezulu bafika.
Meanwhile, it may take years for the city to clean up the area to make way for suitable subsidized housing in Cato Crest as the settlement within continues to expand.
I don't want to say when, because it's a long-term. That one is a long-term intervention. The short-term intervention is what I'm saying to you, that for this 370, we are looking for a land or another alternative that municipality can provide, just to make them not to come and build here. Yes, because this place is not suitable for that. We have just removed people in this place. I think it was 2015, yes, but they came and built again. So we have to make a proper plan so that they mustn't come back and use this place, because we will be on the same situation if we allow them to do that.
For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Karinda Jagmohan in Durban.
All right, that story providing us a context of the conversation we're about to have now, and we're joined by the forensic manager at the International Committee of the Red Cross, Stephen Fonseca, who speaks to us now. Stephen, good morning to you, and thank you very much for making the time. Let's start the conversation with how the Red Cross, this is an international organization,
correct,
how Red Cross is able to provide assistance in disasters such as the one that the people of KwaZulu-Natal are once again facing?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. The International Committee of the Red Cross is part of a movement. So we have the South African Red Cross Society, we have the International Federation and the International Committee of the Red Cross, all in one movement. We're all responding to humanitarian tragedies. With respect to a flood being a disaster, it could be many people killed, many people go missing. We experience very similar tragedies in conflict, in violence, in other forms of migration, etc. So a disaster for the International Committee of the Red Cross is a similar humanitarian catastrophe where there's going to be people who have gone missing, they need to be found, and in some cases they're going to be decedents. They're going to be dead people who have to be identified. Yeah. We've termed the term humanitarian forensic action because most people will think forensics and will have the CSI effect and think about criminal investigations. But forensics is very much ingrained also in humanitarian responses. We need the law and the science to work in combination with humanity and dignity to ensure that people are forensically and reliably identified and returned back to their family. And that's what the RCRC is promoting to state authorities and non-state organizations.
This conversation comes at an opportune time for disaster teams in KwaZulu-Natal where recent floods have once again wreaked havoc, and the understanding is that there are still some people missing. How do you guide, how do you advise those teams in order to conduct their work in such a way that those people are found and then the process of identification or identifying the dead comes about?
So it is a process, and I think what's really important is everybody who's part of that process understands that it's very much multidisciplinary and multi-organizational. And I think, and we've learned across the world that organizations do need to start partnering and collaborating more to ensure that the outcome for the family is the identification of their loved one and the return of a loved one. So it starts with the search and the recovery efforts. The way that people are searched for and recovered has a huge impact on the identification. So the longer the search goes on, the longer the recovery period, the more challenging the identification becomes from a forensic point of view. And the more the families suffer. So, we spend a lot of time around the world trying to promote, first of all, disaster plans that include a mass fatality component to it, so that there are no surprises, there are policies and processes in place, so that everybody follows the correct approach that has been adapted through many lessons learned across the world. And then when they do recover the remains, they're recovering with dignity, but also ensuring the preservation of all those identification elements that are needed to expedite that identification so that the family are given word as soon as possible.
Can I place a bit of a focus on the search?
Yes.
This morning I was reading an article where one family lost their grandmother, and it appears that she was washed away from the Cato Crest area, and later in the few days she is found at the harbour. That's right in Durban Central. Right. How do teams conduct their work in such a way that the search time is shortened? Because, as you say, families are suffering.
So the key is coordination between a number of different organizations. Not any one organization is ultimately going to be able to conduct that kind of a search. You need a lot of community players involved. You want to expedite the timeliness of the recovery. But bearing in mind, when we're dealing with waterways, we're dealing with bodies that will flow from one point to another point. And often it crosses jurisdictions, it crosses agencies, mandates, and so they have to work together on a much more centralized approach, a much more coordinated approach. This is very similar to what we see in conflict or in migration, where we're arguing more for standardized, centralized approaches, where many organizations understand the expertise that exists between them, and they're able then to do different types of searches. So we know in this particular circumstance you've given us, there are water recovery experts. There are, if the body even extended into the ocean, there are oceanographic experts. And so the RCRC has worked with universities and academics to try and understand even taphonomy. What happens to a body in waterways? How does a body float? How does a body sink? When would you likely recover a body?
Yeah.
There's so much that already exists today that states can learn from as they develop their mass fatality capabilities, so that they can recover the body quickly.
So from the search to a point now where the body is recovered, talk to us about the state of the remains when a body has been in water for a certain amount of time, and of course the identification process. Explain that to us.
Yeah, so even the recovery itself is a very delicate process. The last thing we want is recovery experts to pull a body out and potentially dismember a body or lose critical evidence, lose jewelry that might actually come off the finger. So it's so important that what is collected and where the body is collected is very, very captured in full detail, so that the identification experts at the end understand the circumstances, the temporal data, the spatial data, and then get the most of the remains to allow for an identification through various means. So when the body is recovered, the body is going to be taken to a mortuary. And that's where the identification really starts. In water cases, sadly, decomposition and changes to that body occur very rapidly, especially when the water is warmer. If it's colder, that basically delays the decomposition a little bit more. But there's also scavenging. There's a number of different elements that can really present challenges to the identification. And it's often in the areas where we rely on actual identification features, such as your hands. Fingerprints are very important in South Africa. From an identification point of view, there's a national fingerprint database with the Home Affairs Department. So if those fingers no longer exist or the fingers are damaged, you may lose a fingerprint opportunity. Yeah. There's other ways that would be impacting the identification too.
Let's then conclude the conversation on this very matter of forensics. There are some families who say to this day they have still not been able to have their loved ones found. This is now the April floods. The floods we're talking about, they happened recently, but there were floods, devastating floods, where more than 400 people died in KZN. That process, where ultimately some remains are found, the state of decomposition, I mean, that it really would be far advanced. Correct. How difficult does that make the work of forensics?
So I think we're very fortunate that forensics has advanced dramatically in the last 2 or 3 decades. So if you have recovered remains, the chances of actually collecting enough information from that body, even in a decomposed state, is very, very good. Yeah. DNA, potentially fingerprints, some sort of dental information. There's lots of actual features on a body, even in a decomposed state, that you can collect towards identification. The challenges that families are facing, and this is across the world, not South Africa specifically, is there's no system that operates where families either have access to report someone missing, or the information that is being collected is being centralized so that all unidentified bodies are going into one database, and all the missing people are going into one database. And all of these queries and comparisons are allowed to happen. So it's not, I'm not surprised by the fact that bodies have still not been identified, and we know that is an issue, both in South Africa and across the world, because we don't have the other information that would allow for those comparisons to be made to make the identification possible. And that's where families become such a critical part. And in humanitarian forensic action, that's why families and communities are so important for the ICRC to be included in this process.
What kind of advice would you give to families who are still missing loved ones, whether in these recent floods or extending back to April of 2022? What would the advice be?
So the first step in the process is always report your missing person. And we appreciate in South Africa and other countries that there's a lot of people that are fearful of the authorities. They may be undocumented. They might not be able to approach the authorities. But you cannot have someone identified unless there's something to compare against. Sure. So it's so important for communities to report missing persons. even if they can do so anonymously through an intermediary. And that's where the International Committee of the Red Cross and our movement could play a role in the future. It's so important to get that information about the missing. Otherwise, the unidentified body, if they don't match a national database, will be buried in a common grave and left there for weeks, months, decades, while the families suffer with ambiguous loss, not knowing what happened.
Stephen Fonseca, thank you very much for your time.